a world apart. The sky was a liquid canvas of lavender and gold, its colors shifting like oil on water. Kale stood at the edge of the observation deck, his hands gripping the railing as he scanned the alien horizon. His sleek uniform marked him as a xeno-diplomat, though the tension in his shoulders suggested anything but ease. Today, he was to initiate first contact with the Avar, a species so elusive that their existence had been debated for centuries. Behind him, Amara, his communications specialist, adjusted the translator device strapped to her wrist. Still no signs of aggression, she said, her tone betraying the edge of disbelief. No defensive posturing, no visible weaponry. Either they're completely non-hostile, or they don't see us as a threat, Kale finished. He turned to face her, his gray eyes narrowing. The Avar didn't survive in isolation this long by being naive. Stay sharp, Amara nodded, her auburn braids swaying as she double-checked the device. The deck beneath them hummed softly, the landing platform extending toward the alien city. From their vantage point, the settlement looked like a sprawling labyrinth of translucent structures, their surfaces alive with shifting patterns of light. The air shimmered with heat, or perhaps it was something else entirely. A sudden vibration coursed through the deck. Kale tensed as a group of Avar emerged from the city's perimeter, their figures tall and serpentine, cloaked in layers of fabric that seemed to float independently of gravity. Their eyes glowed faintly, twin orbs of cerulean light set within elongated, featureless faces. They moved in silence, their steps synchronized as though they shared a single mind. "Here they come," Amara whispered. Her voice was steady, but Kale caught the way her fingers tightened around the translator. The Avar leader stopped a mere 5 paces away, the rest forming a precise semicircle behind them. For a moment, neither side spoke. Kale's training flooded his mind. Body language first, then verbal communication. He raised his right hand, palm open, a universal gesture of peace. The Avar leader mimicked the motion, their movements fluid and deliberate. "We come in peace," Kale said, his voice even. The translator hummed, projecting his words in a resonant tone that carried across the space. The Avar leader tilted their head, a subtle ripple of light passing over their garments. When they spoke, their voice was a harmonic blend of tones, as if several individuals were speaking in unison. The translator struggled for a moment before rendering the response. "Peace is a mutable construct. Your presence here tilts the balance." Kale exchanged a glance with Amara. The response was not hostile, but neither was it reassuring. He stepped forward cautiously. "We seek to understand your people, to learn and exchange knowledge." The Avar leader's glowing eyes flickered briefly. "Understanding is a heavy burden. It reshapes those who carry it." Amara's translator crackled, struggling to keep pace with the complex syntax. She frowned, whispering, "This doesn't sound like a negotiation." Kale ignored her, focusing on the Avar. "Knowledge is worth the wait. Our cultures may differ, but collaboration can strengthen us both." The Avar leader was silent for a moment, their luminous gaze piercing. Then they extended a hand, their fingers impossibly long and jointless. Kale hesitated before stepping closer and mirroring the gesture. When their palms touched, an electric jolt surged through him. Not painful, but disorienting. His vision blurred, and suddenly he was no longer on the platform. He stood in a vast expanse of light, the ground beneath him a liquid mirror reflecting an infinite sky. Surrounding him were echoes, fragments of voices, laughter, and sorrow, all blending into an incomprehensible symphony. In the distance, shapes moved, indistinct yet familiar. "You seek to understand," a voice said, resonating from everywhere and nowhere. The Avar leader materialized before him, their form shifting like a mirage. "Then you must experience the weight of your presence." Kale struggled to speak, but the air seemed to steal his words. Images flashed before his eyes, the Avar city crumbling, their people scattered. He felt their fear, their pain, and their resolve, a visceral tapestry of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. What is this?" he managed, his voice hoarse. A fragment of possibility, the Avar replied. Your arrival ripples through our existence. To know us is to change us. Kale's mind reeled. He had studied countless first contact scenarios, prepared for hostility, confusion, even mistrust. But this was something else entirely. We don't want to harm you, he said, his voice firm despite the chaos around him. We only want to coexist. The Avar's form solidified, their glowing eyes dimming. Coexistence requires equilibrium. Your kind struggles to see beyond your own reflection. Kale felt a pang of guilt, though he wasn't sure why. The Avar extended their hand again, and this time, the gesture carried an air of finality. Return. Reflect. And when you are ready to carry the burden, we will speak again. Kale gasped as reality snapped back into focus. He was on the platform once more, his hands still touching the Avar leaders. They withdrew, their movements as fluid as before. Amara was at his side instantly. Kale? What happened? He shook his head, struggling to steady his breathing. I don't know. They showed me something. The Avar leaders stepped back, their harmonic voice resonating one last time. Your intent has been received. The answer awaits your readiness. Without another word, they turned and glided back toward the city, their forms blending into the shimmering heat. Kale watched them go, his mind racing. Amara touched his arm, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. Are you okay? What did they show you? Kale looked at her, his eyes haunted. The cost of understanding. They stood in silence, the alien city glowing in the distance, its patterns shifting like whispers in the wind. The path forward was unclear, but one thing was certain. The weight of their presence had only just begun to settle. Tensions and revelations. The town of Ashborne sat under a sky bruised by impending storm clouds, its cobblestone streets slick with the mist of early evening. At the heart of the town square, a bell tower loomed, its chime long since silenced by disrepair. Around it, the lives of Ashbourne's citizens unfolded in quiet cycles, until the arrival of Arlen Cade. Arlen stood by the fountain, his weathered coat still dripping from the last downpour. A foreigner to Ashbourne, he exuded an air of quiet authority that clashed with his unassuming demeanor. His steel-gray eyes scanned the square, lingering on faces too timid to hold his gaze. The letter in his pocket weighed heavier than it should have, its contents a secret that could fracture the fragile calm of this isolated town. Looking for someone? A voice called out, sharp and clear. Arlen turned to see a woman leaning against the corner of a bakery. Her auburn hair, tied back with careless precision, glinted in the dim light. The look in her eyes was sharper than her tone, a mix of curiosity and caution. I could ask you the same, he replied evenly. Maeve Hart, she said, stepping forward and extending a hand. Her grip was firm, her smile thin. And you must be the one they're whispering about. Arlen Cade, he said, releasing her hand. Didn't realize I'd made an impression already. Maeve's laugh was short, almost bitter. In a place like this, new faces don't stay new for long. Word travels faster than reason. As if to illustrate her point, a pair of townsfolk hurried past them, their murmurs just audible over the wind. Arlen caught fragments, him, inquiry, trouble. He resisted the urge to sigh. I'm here on business, Arlen said, turning his attention back to Maeve. Nothing more. Business with who? Arlen hesitated. The truth wasn't hers to know. Not yet. Someone who owes answers, he said finally. Maeve arched an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Instead, she tilted her head toward the northern road. If you're staying long, the inn's up that way. I'd recommend the ale. The beds, not so much. I'll manage, Arlen said, tipping his hat in thanks. He walked away, aware of Maeve's gaze following him until he disappeared around the corner. The inn was modest, its wooden signs swinging precariously in the wind. Inside, the scent of damp wood mingled with the tang of spilled ale. A fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows over the handful of patrons. Behind the counter stood Tobias Merrick, the innkeeper, whose thick arms and graying beard gave him the look of a retired blacksmith. He greeted Arlen with a nod, but his eyes betrayed unease. "Room for the night?" Tobias asked. "Maybe longer," Arlen replied, placing a few coins on the counter. Tobias swept the coins into his hand and gestured toward the staircase. "Third door on the left. Dinner's another coin if you're hungry." Arlen shook his head. "I'll be fine." As he climbed the stairs, he heard the low hum of conversation behind him, punctuated by occasional glances in his direction. Tobias's voice rose above the murmurs, admonishing the patrons to mind their own affairs, but the damage was done. Arlen's presence had already stirred the waters. The room was sparse but clean. A single window overlooked the square, where the bell tower loomed like a sentinel. Arlen unbuttoned his coat and removed the letter from his pocket. The seal, a serpent coiled around a dagger, was unbroken. He stared at it for a long moment before setting it aside. There were more pressing matters to consider. Maeve didn't trust him. She had spent the better part of the evening piecing together what little she could learn about Arlen Cade, but the fragments were maddeningly vague. No one knew where he had come from, only that his arrival coincided with the unease that had settled over Ashborne like a second storm. It wasn't the first time the town had harbored secrets, and Maeve knew better than most how dangerous those secrets could be. She made her way to the edge of town, where the old mill stood abandoned. Its skeletal frame creaked in the wind, a reminder of better times. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with mildew, but Maeve paid it no mind. "Maeve," a voice called softly from the shadows. She turned to see Ethan, his face pale and drawn. His dark eyes darted nervously to the doorway. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Neither should you," Maeve countered. "But we don't have time for caution." "Who is Ethan? What does he want?" Ethan hesitated, his hands twisting the brim of his hat. "He's looking for the ledger." Maeve's blood ran cold. "The ledger? How does he know about that?" "I don't know," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "But if he finds it—" "He won't," Maeve interrupted. "I'll make sure of it." Ethan's expression darkened. "You can't stop him, Maeve. He's not like us." "What do you mean?" Ethan opened his mouth to answer, but a sudden noise from outside froze them both. Footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, approached the mill. Maeve's hand instinctively went to the dagger at her belt. The door creaked open, and Arlen Cade stepped inside. "Am I interrupting?" he asked, his tone unreadable. Maeve moved to block Ethan, her dagger glinting in the dim light. "You don't belong here." Arlen raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to fight. I just want to talk." "Talk about what?" Maeve demanded. "The ledger," Arlen said simply. Ethan's gasp was audible, and Maeve's grip on her dagger tightened. "How do you know about it?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. Arlen took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "Because it's the reason I'm here. And unless we work together, it's going to destroy us all." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. Maeve's mind raced, but she saw no deception in Arlen's face, only resolve. "Start talking," she said, lowering the dagger, but not releasing it. Arlen nodded. "But first, you need to decide if you're ready to hear what I have to say. Once you do, there's no turning back." Maeve glanced at Ethan, whose face was a mask of fear. She turned back to Arlen, her jaw set. "Tell me." The storm outside broke, rain hammering against the mill's roof as Arlen began to speak. Unity through understanding. The small village of Valeford sat shrouded in perpetual mist, a place where stories of the past lingered like the fog that clung to its cobblestone streets. Nestled in a deep valley, surrounded by towering pines, the villagers were a curious mix of traditionalists and dreamers, bound together by their shared isolation. Yet, beneath the surface of their quaint community, divisions simmered, fueled by fears of the unknown and mistrust of outsiders. At the heart of this tension was Arlen, the village's stoic blacksmith. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wielded his hammer with the precision of a master craftsman, yet his silence carried more weight than his tools. Arlen had lived in Valeford his entire life, and his roots ran deep. His family had worked the forge for 3 generations. But he bore an invisible scar, a sister, lost to the forest years ago under circumstances the villagers refused to discuss. In stark contrast was Celine, an outsider who had arrived 6 months prior. With her raven-black hair and pale, weathered face, she looked every bit the part of a wanderer. She was an herbalist, tending to wounds and brewing elixirs with a skill that bordered on uncanny. Her knowledge came from lands far beyond Valeford, and though she healed their sick, many whispered of witchcraft. The central conflict began on a storm-laden evening. Thunder rumbled in the distance as the villagers gathered in the town hall, a dilapidated structure where even the rafters sagged from age. The atmosphere was tense. A young boy, Elias, had vanished. His mother, a frantic woman named Hester, stood trembling before the crowd. He was playing by the edge of the forest. Hester sobbed, her voice breaking. I turned my back for a moment, and he was gone. Please, someone must search for him. A murmur spread through the room like wildfire. The forest had long been a source of fear, a place where the trees whispered and shadows moved of their own accord. Those who ventured too deep often did not return. Foolishness, cried Garin, the town's self-appointed leader. A grizzled man with a hawk-like nose. He carried himself with an air of authority that belied his narrow-mindedness. The forest is cursed. If the boy's gone, it's the price we pay for meddling too close. Celine rose from her seat, her expression sharp. You'd let a child die because of your superstition? She asked, her voice cutting through the din. I'll go find him. The room fell silent, every eye turning to her. Arlen leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, observing her with a quiet intensity. You? Garin sneered. What do you know of our forest? You don't belong here, outsider. And yet, I'm the only one willing to act, Celine retorted. Her gaze swept the room. Unless someone else has the courage? For a moment, no one moved. Then, to everyone's surprise, Arlen stepped forward. I'll go with her, he said. His deep voice carried a finality that silenced any objections. Celine regarded him with a mix of gratitude and curiosity. They had rarely spoken, but she had sensed the weight of his presence since her arrival. Arlen's agreement was unexpected, yet it carried an unspoken understanding. He had his reasons, and she wouldn't question them. They departed at dusk, armed with little more than lanterns, a hunting knife, and Arlen's hammer. The forest loomed ahead, its twisted branches clawing at the sky. The rain had begun in earnest, turning the ground to mud and casting the world into a kaleidoscope of shadows. As they walked, Celine broke the silence. You didn't have to come? I know, Arlen replied. His eyes remained fixed on the path ahead. But I couldn't stand by and do nothing. There was more to his words, Celine felt, but she let them hang in the air. She had learned to recognize the weight of unspoken pain. Hours passed as they ventured deeper into the forest, the lantern light barely piercing the oppressive darkness. The sounds of the village faded, replaced by the eerie symphony of rustling leaves and distant howls. It was Celine who finally stopped, kneeling to inspect the ground. Tracks, she murmured, brushing away the wet leaves. Small footprints heading east. Arlen crouched beside her, his brow furrowed. The boy. Most likely. But he's not alone. She pointed to another set of tracks, larger, heavier, and distinctly clawed. Arlen's jaw tightened. Wolves? No, Celine said softly. Something else? They pressed on, the air growing colder with each step. The mist thickened, curling around their ankles like living tendrils. Suddenly, a guttural growl broke the silence, and the lantern flickered ominously. From the shadows emerged a creature unlike anything they had imagined. Standing on hind legs, it was a grotesque blend of wolf and man, its eyes glowing an unnatural shade of yellow. Its maw dripped with saliva, and its claws gleamed in the dim light. Celine moved first, tossing a pouch of powder into the air. It exploded in a burst of white smoke, causing the creature to recoil and snarl. Run, she shouted, grabbing Arlen's arm. But Arlen stood his ground, gripping his hammer tightly. Go find the boy, he commanded. I'll hold it off. Celine hesitated, her instincts screaming to flee, yet unwilling to abandon him. Then she nodded, darting past the creature as it lunged at Arlen. The blacksmith fought with a ferocity born of desperation. His hammer connected with bone and sinew, but the creature was unnaturally resilient. It swiped at him, raking its claws across his arm, yet he didn't falter. Each blow was calculated, each movement driven by a purpose he couldn't fully articulate. Meanwhile, Celine followed the footprints to a small clearing. There, huddled beneath a fallen tree, was Elias. The boy was trembling, his face streaked with tears. "Elias," Celine whispered, crouching beside him. "It's okay. I'm here to take you home." The boy clung to her, his small hands gripping her cloak. But as she turned to leave, the shadows shifted, and another creature stepped into the clearing. This one was smaller, but no less menacing. Its eyes locked on her with predatory intent. Celine's mind raced. She had only one pouch of powder left, and no time to waste. Holding Elias close, she hurled the pouch at the creature's feet, creating another burst of smoke. Then she ran, her heart pounding as she retraced her steps. She found Arlen moments later, battered but alive, standing over the lifeless body of the larger beast. His hammer dripped with dark ichor, and his face was pale from blood loss. "You found him," he said, his voice strained but steady. Celine nodded. "Let's get out of here." Together, they made their way back to Vale Ford, the boy safe between them. As they emerged from the forest, the villagers gathered in stunned silence, their expressions a mix of awe and shame. Arlen and Celine exchanged a glance. In that moment, an unspoken bond formed between them, a unity forged through understanding and sacrifice. They had faced the darkness together and emerged stronger for it. But the forest still loomed, its secrets far from uncovered. And though they had won this battle, both knew their journey was only beginning.